Thank you so much for joining me all the way forward. I'm Eddie Francis, and as promised, joining us is Courtney Bowden. And Courtney, I have to say this about Courtney first of all. So Courtney is down in Playa del Carmen. She's in Mexico. And we started the conversation off air about how the weather is. And she said, "Oh, it's been cool down here." So I'm asking, okay, well, what's cool? What's the temperature? This sister says 65.
Well, that's cool for us.
I know it's cool for you down in Playa del Carmen.
But that might sound a little balmy to those who are in the single digits right about now. So
Yes.
I won't rub it in too much
I would invite you to talk to the people in Chicago.
because they're freezing.
Courtney, thank you so much for joining me for a very important conversation. I wanted to start this year off by talking to our listeners about media literacy because so many of us get lost in the sauce when it comes to media. We see a headline here, a headline there, and then we are off to the races. And just to give you some context about something that I talked about earlier in this episode, I mentioned that there was a media headline from Axios that said that Trump administration cracked down on DEI changes MLK Day. The issue I took with that headline was the word crackdown because that implies that DEI is something, it implies that it's unethical. It implies that it is even illegal. It implies that it is somehow troublesome. And to me, the headline probably should have read Trump administration reaction to DEI changes,
Yes.
and that is something that I want our listeners to look out for, because not to get lost in this point again, but to me, DEI has been the crackdown on unethical behavior and that sort of thing. So, with that being said, you have explored the images of Black folks in media,
Yes.
which is very relevant to this radio station. And so let's talk about that because I'm passionate about that issue as well. Let's start with the research that you conducted in 2000 or about the earthquake in 2010 in Haiti,
Yes.
and a portrayal of that country and the portrayal of Haitians. Talk about those portrayals that you researched and why you were even interested in that media coverage in the first place.
Well, first, thank you so much for having me today, Eddie. It's a pleasure to be with you. And um, as it relates to my research around the portrayals of Black folks, um, during my time pursuing a master's in media studies at Penn State, I was really focused on one central question, which was how does mainstream media frame Black people during moments of crisis? And I think that this particular question is very relevant to everything, all of the chaos that we're experiencing today, right? And we can probably expand that question to include Black people and other marginalized folks, given everything that we're seeing with the ICE occupations, the mass deportations, et cetera. But at that exact moment, the 2010 earthquakes, when I was doing my studies, the earthquakes in Haiti were unfolding in real time and around the clock and across every major cable news network, if you could remember that time. And it was at that time the most devastating natural disaster that the island had ever experienced. And so that gave me a rare opportunity to study how mainstream media, how legacy media talks about and depicts Black people as a crisis is happening instead of years later and not through hindsight. So instead of analyzing a historical case after the dust had settled, I was watching those narratives form in real time. And I could see which storylines took hold quickly, whose voices were elevated, whose voices were silenced, whose humanity was prioritized, whose humanity was flattened, and how long those impressions really tend to last once they entered the public imagination. And so what emerged from that study were a few clear patterns that are especially important to name. One of the most striking findings was that the US cable news networks didn't treat the earthquake as the disaster, interestingly enough. It actually treated Haiti, the country, and the people itself as the disaster. And so the coverage really framed the disaster, the devastation, as something that was expected, almost inevitable. So anytime we hear anything in the mainstream about Haiti, it's always something around disaster or, political instability. And so by stripping away political and historical context, we just get these flattened narratives. And so colonial exploitation, international debt, right? Because Haiti is still paying France for its independence. Foreign policy decisions that had weakened the country long before the earthquakes, those things were largely absent when we were talking about when I was studying the earthquakes in the coverage in the media. And so that omission was not accidental. And so including that context would have required acknowledging, honestly, the role that the US and other Western powers played in destabilizing Haiti over the course of generations. And leaving it out shifts responsibility away from systems and institutions and onto the country and its people. Another major finding was that I noticed was that Haitians were largely made visible but rarely authoritative. So we saw these striking images on screen. We saw them as victims and evidence. We saw evidence of suffering, but these folks were very seldom given a voice as experts or decision makers. It was like other people were speaking for them, like American journalists, aid workers, remember, and officials that dominated the narrative. And, I don't believe that imbalance is neutral. It reinforces the idea that solutions come from outside of the community and that Haitians really exist to be rescued, then recognized as agents of their own survival. But what's really interesting about that is when you dig into the history of Haiti, that framing is especially distorted because it contradicts history. Haiti, for those that are unaware, is the first free Black republic in the Western Hemisphere. Its
Yeah.
successful fight for independence from France in the early 1800s really inspired slave uprisings across the United States. A lot of people are unaware of that. And so when that history is erased in the mainstream media, then, of course, Haitians will be framed as helpless instead of what they've always been, a people with a long legacy of resistance and self determination. And finally, another clear pattern that I noticed was how quickly stereotypes stepped in to fill the gaps when nuance disappeared. So a lot of that coverage emphasized chaos and disorder, right? And that framing felt familiar because those are common narratives, narrative devices that are used when the mainstream often talks about Haiti. But during Hurricane Katrina,
Yeah.
for instance, white evacuees were described as survivors, while Black evacuees were labeled as looters and refugees. And so the disaster changed, but the language didn't. And I saw that emotion consistently mattered more than accuracy. And cable news prioritizes urgency and dramatic visuals. That repeating pattern, those early claims often exist for hours, days, sometimes even weeks. And so by the time that corrections are made to what actually happened on the ground, most people have already made up their minds. And so that's the unfortunate consequence of 24/7 cable news cycles, because repetition does the work, right?
Yeah.
And when the message plays on loop, it starts to feel true. So, my research essentially shows that disasters don't create narratives about Black people. They activate them, they sort of solidify them. And crisis really becomes the permission slip for a lot of these media companies to recycle long standing storylines and stereotypes under the banner of breaking news.
Okay. There's so much in that answer.
It was a lot. It's a lot. I
I'm,
know.
I'm trying to. I mean, I don't know if you've ever heard of a doberge cake. Down that we have down a multi-layered cake. This is
Yeah.
like a doberge cake of understanding of media images, and wow. So the the thing that what you said that really really stands out is how there is this selectivity of stereotypes over nuance.
Yes.
We had the exact same conversations, of course, because I know Katrina was part of your lit review, the
Yes.
information and the media reports about Katrina. But we had that very same conversation only 5 years earlier, where the image was these black people just wait for the government every time they get in trouble. When the real story was the state of Louisiana has sold the city of New Orleans down, pardon the pun, up the river. And that's why there was such weak levee systems in the first place, especially on the Orleans Parish side, which is where the Ninth Ward was, which the Ninth Ward
Yes.
got the worst of it. And so that was one that was something that really frustrated us, especially black folks in New Orleans. That absence of nuance about what actually happened. But what's
Yeah.
interesting, Courtney, is that even even white people in New Orleans caught hell over the stereotypes of black people after Katrina. Even white
I
people.
could see that.
Because the media was so hell bent on telling the story they wanted to tell. And you had white people who were like, whoa, 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 we suffered too.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so it's very interesting. I want to move on to, because you did cover a lot of the Haitian earthquake and how there were so many parallels with Katrina. Um so to the people who have been arguing for years, who have been marked as conspiracy theorists, who have been saying for years that these images of black folks in media are coordinated and they are intentional. How do you respond to that?
Well, that's a good question, Eddie. When people say that media portrayals of Black people feel intentional, I can understand where that instinct and where that sentiment comes from. Because when you see the same patterns repeat across decades and across networks and across crises, it doesn't feel random anymore, right? Just in this conversation alone, we've covered how these depictions have shown up during the Haiti earthquakes, Hurricane Katrina, even during the pandemic, right? And so
Yep.
what we're really seeing is how systems behave when they're driven by profit, speed, and longstanding cultural stereotypes. Because, and we had this conversation off air not too long ago where I said this, that it is very profitable to punch down on Black people. And
Hmm.
news and media organizations operate under intense pressure to be fast, to be dramatic, and to be emotionally engaging. There is a saying in the news that if it bleeds, it leads,
It leads.
right?
Yes, I tell people that all the time. Yeah.
Yeah, especially in moments of crises. These companies, these organizations, these media platforms tend to reach for familiar storylines that audiences already recognize. And these storylines are shaped by history, by racial stereotypes that have circulated for generations. And they're also shaped by who holds power and decision making power in these newsrooms and within those decision making roles in the C suite. So the result feels intentional because it's consistent
Hmm.
and it could be better understood as structural. The other important piece is the reason why I feel so intentional is because of whose voices are missing, right?
Hmm.
When newsrooms and media organizations lack racial, cultural, and regional diversity, then there's blind spots. And those blind spots turn into glaring patterns. And the stories that get told about Black communities, they get told about Black communities instead of told with them. And so over time, that absence of our voices hardens into a distorted picture that keeps reproducing itself. And so, that realization, because earlier you asked me why I'm so interested in all of this, and it really stems from personal experience. My interest in this topic isn't simply academic. I grew up in a sundown town where the message about who belonged was communicated clearly before it was even spoken. And as a child, I didn't quite understand why that was, but eventually I came to understand that those assumptions that people around me, that my neighbors, that my teachers, that the administrators in my schools, they weren't personal. they were learned. They were learned from the media. People had absorbed enough media portrayals of Blackness to believe that they already knew who I was and what I was capable of and what I might be guilty of before they even got to know me. And the media essentially had storyboarded my life before I even had the chance to author it myself. So when I later watched how Haiti was covered after earthquakes, how the city of New Orleans and Black New Orleanians were depicted, I recognized the pattern immediately because it was a different place, but the same script. And that's why media literacy matters, because these portrayals shape empathy. They influence policy. They determine which communities are seen as worthy of care versus control. And media also teaches us how to interpret Black life. And, it's important that we question it because it's a necessary skill for anyone who truly wants to be informed, especially because we're inundated with so much information.
You're listening to The Way Forward. I'm Eddie Francis, and we're talking to Courtney Bowden. And Courtney is a storyteller. She's a writer, and Courtney is someone who has researched the images of Black folks in media. And as you were speaking, the question that popped in my head is, what have these portrayals done to us, to Black people? I was watching the Jubilee YouTube video, Amanda Seals, one Black radical surrounded by 20 Black conservatives. One of the conservatives sat down in front of Amanda Seals, even though she has said several times, "I'm not a liberal." One of them sat down in front of her and said, "I'm not a liberal because I work hard." And it was very interesting to hear a Black man believe that Black people who do not subscribe to his conservative beliefs are not hard workers. And the first thing I thought when he said that was, these media portrayals have bent your brain. You honestly
Yes.
believe that Black people don't work hard. What have been your observations of what these media images have done to us, to Black people IRL in real life?
Hmm. Well, that's a wonderful question. Media images are one of the most powerful ways to tell a story.
Hmm.
And they impact the ways that we see each other and that we see ourselves. And so if we are always seeing ourselves downtrodden, in struggle, right? In crises, in trauma, then those are the stories, those are the narratives that are going to essentially invade our imaginations, right, and the imaginations of others. So people are going to treat us according to how they see us in the media. So that's what it does. It essentially, as I mentioned before, storyboards our lives without any attention to or any in-depth knowledge of our interior lives and maybe the historical context from which we come, and it can truly damage how we not only see ourselves but how other people see us. And so it is very important that we combat these harmful tropes, these harmful narratives about Black people, Black lives, because it shows up in how people vote for certain policies, what policies get presented to vote on, things of that nature. It has a very real world impact beyond just what we witness.
Let's dive into policy since you brought that up. I think it is immensely important to cover this. How do these images influence policy?
Oh man, like I said, there have been multiple studies where, for instance, for local news,
Hmm.
whenever there are crimes reported, we tend to see the mugshots of the alleged criminal, right? If more so if they are Black or a person of color than we do if the person who is alleged to do the crime is white.
Yeah.
Okay. And so you have a whole swath of people who are viewing these images. They're sitting down and watching their 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, maybe 11 o'clock news. And if all they're seeing about Black people and people of color is centered around crime, criminality, that is going to submit in their mind that, oh my goodness, well, maybe we do need to close these borders,
Mm-hmm.
right? Maybe we do need to have uh, an entity like ICE to take these folks off the streets. So when we talk about the policy implications, this is not abstract. This is real life where we're dealing
Yeah.
with this right now. And because the 24/7 nature of media, we are constantly inundated with these images. Remember when television used to actually go off? They would sing,
Yes.
it would be the national anthem, and
Yeah.
then that would be the end of your television consumption for that
And then,
day.
and then when you had three major networks and PBS, right?
Right.
And then you had limited time
That's
in
it.
front of the television.
Right. Now,
Hmm.
those stories get looped, those images get looped again and again and again. And so, if that's all you're seeing about a particular group of people, that is what you'll tend to believe because, again, media is one of the most powerful ways to tell a story. And then, when you are presented with a voting ballot or when a candidate starts, speaking in those dog whistles about the
Law and
folks.
Order.
Right. Law and order. We're going to get the country, we're going to take our country back. That
Mhm.
type of rhetoric then continues to it continues,
Yeah.
and it puts us in a position where we're seeing folks as problems to be managed as opposed to humans,
Yeah.
right, to interact with, to be in conversation with. And unfortunately, I think this extends to social media as well, because when we're not watching the news, when we're not watching television, a lot of us are we're encountering so much content through our phones, and we also have to deal with AI.
Yeah.
So deep fake
Hmm.
images that are not even real, it starts to distort our our view of each other, and I think that's really unfortunate.
Yeah. And Courtney, I've actually heard politicians say on legislative floors when they were either, trying to push a bill or they were defending a bill, they would say things like, "Have you seen the media reports?" And you and I both know that a lot of times, especially television media, they'll present a piece of data and not even have the context for the data, but they'll present the data as if that is gospel. And then that's
Right.
it. And then it gets to the legislative floor. Have you seen the media reports? And then you have a bunch of legislators making decisions that are pretty uninformed a lot of times. And to me, that is probably the most damning thing
Yes.
of them all. I wanted
Yes.
to jump to what it is that we need to do. One of the pieces that you wrote is 5 ways to guard yourself against fake news, and to me, the portrayals of Black folks in media is probably the original fake news from way back in the day, from when we started having media, even in the first place, or at
Yes.
least mass media. And so, do you believe that there is a way for Black folks to take steps against harmful media portrayals? And if so, what do those types of steps look like?
Absolutely. There are some real steps that we can take. One thing I'm very adamant about is encouraging us and empowering us to know that we have agency. Um, and it starts with recognizing the sheer power of our influence. I'm talking about Black audiences now, right? Because we over index on media and social media consumption. We're highly engaged audiences. We watch closely, we talk back, we circulate stories, and we set trends. That level of engagement means our intention has consequences. So, what does that look like? What does it look like to take our power back in practice? Well, I think it starts with everyday choices. It looks like being intentional about what you like, share, repost, and comment on. Algorithms don't just track views, Okay, they track engagement. And so when harmful or shallow portrayals of ourselves get the most attention, they're rewarded with more visibility. And so when thoughtful, nuanced Black stories are supported, those stories travel further. So I would encourage us to actually put our attention and our money and our engagement where our mouth is, right? Where our values lie. And it also looks like being selective about what we consume for entertainment purposes and also informational purposes. It can start by asking yourself simple questions like, who created this? And who benefits from it? Who's financing it? We have to follow the money. And does this content align with the values that I say I care about? But the more concrete and probably the most important step is economic. We have to intentionally support and invest in media that reflects our values and not just rely on consuming what's loud, popular, or easy to access. Mainstream media dominates because they're heavily funded and widely distributed. Independent Black media rarely has that advantage. And so that doesn't make it less rigorous or less necessary, but it requires more conscious support from us. It requires sharing, subscribing, donating, and showing up for ourselves consistently. Because if we only engage with stories that are already everywhere, we reinforce the same limited portrayals that we claim to be tired of. So we do have power. Supporting independent platforms creates space for fuller stories, more lived experiences, and complexity, nuance, things that are missing in mainstream portrayals of Black people. And that's exactly why I created Black Expat Stories, which it's an independent media platform that I'm building to document Black life beyond crises, beyond the headlines, and beyond stereotypes. Through long form conversations and documentary storytelling, it centers Black people as the narrators of our own lives. Because when we tell our own stories in our own words, that also allows us to take our power back, and it allows us to make intentional choices. And I always say that it is so difficult to be what you cannot see. And in creating Black Expat Stories, we're highlighting the pioneers of America's next great migration, folks who have courageously made the move from the United States and have found healing, belonging, and community abroad. And I want more people to see what that could look like. I want to combat so many of these stereotypical portrayals of us and show Black people living full, thriving lives. So that's what we can do.
And I would add to that is you don't have to agree with 100%. I mean, my good frat brother Roland Martin, who is just fiery as fiery can be, and people will hear him say one thing they don't like, and it's like, oh, I'm not watching them anymore. It's like, yeah, but you're gonna keep watching the yelling and screaming on the other big platforms. Why can't you listen to him yell and scream a little bit more? And so
Yeah,
I think I think realizing that we're human too, and our Black media representatives deserve as much grace as anybody else in not having to agree 100% with what they report or the positions that they take on issues. And I think that's one thing that we could do too, is approach it with more grace, approach our
absolutely.
platforms with much more grace.
Absolutely. And I'll add to that, Eddie, and say that um, you don't, it's actually very healthy to consume content and information that you don't necessarily agree with either.
Mhm.
Because when we only consume content that aligns with our worldview, we create our own echo chambers,
Yeah.
and
Yep.
we don't get a chance to hear more fuller perspectives, and so then our worldview becomes very narrow. So it's important to engage with content and with people who we may not necessarily agree with at all, right? Not just occasionally, but at all.
Yeah. Courtney, if anybody wants to find out more information about you, especially what you're doing with Black Expat Stories, how can they find out about you?
Well, the easiest place to connect with me and my work is at my website, thecourtneybowden.com. And it's the central hub where I share reflections on media and storytelling like this, along with updates on my creative projects, writing, and speaking. And it's also where brands and creatives can explore partnering with me as a speaker, marketer, and consulting producer and storytelling to bring culturally grounded ideas to life and create work that's designed for impact and recognition and the stories that deserve more space. A big part of what I'm doing, of course, is Black expat stories. And so for anyone that wants to remain connected beyond that, I'm active on LinkedIn and also on Instagram at the Courtney Bowden there, so you can find me.
All right. Well, the birds agree with you. They definitely agree with you down there in Playa del Carmen. I'm jealous, by the way. But Courtney, thank you so much for joining me on the way forward.
Thank you for having me, Eddie. It was a great pleasure to be here.